I still remember the exact moment the room changed, even though no one else seemed to notice it, as if the air itself had decided to hold its breath just long enough for everything to break. "She's never been enough for this family," my uncle said, his voice calm in the way only people who think they are right can be calm, and I stood there in the hallway of my own life pretending I didn't hear it. My name is Emily Carter, and at 26 years old I had learned how to make myself smaller in rooms that were supposed to feel like home. The Carter household in suburban Chicago looked perfect from the outside. A 2-story brick house with a trimmed lawn and a porch light that always worked, but inside it was a different language, one made of expectations I could never quite meet. That evening, I had come over thinking it would be a simple dinner, something polite, something temporary, but I should have known better when I saw the way my mother avoided my eyes at the table. I had just stepped into the living room when the conversation shifted, sharp and careless, like a door closing without warning. "Emily's choices have always been disappointing," my aunt added, almost casually, as if she were commenting on the weather, and I felt my fingers tighten around the strap of my purse. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to say that I had been working full-time while paying off student loans and trying to build something that didn't collapse under pressure, but the words never came. Instead, I stood there, quietly absorbing sentences that seemed designed to erase me piece by piece. What I didn't know then was that I wasn't the only one listening. Across the street, in a black vehicle that didn't belong to anyone I knew, Ethan Cole had arrived for a meeting that had nothing to do with me. Ethan was not someone people ignored. Even in silence, he carried the kind of presence that made others adjust their tone without realizing it. He had been reviewing documents on his phone when the window of the house caught fragments of conversation, and something in the rhythm of those words made him pause. At first, he didn't react, just listened, his expression unreadable, but then the tone shifted again, and I saw it later in how he went still, like a calculation had just resolved itself in his mind. No one inside the house knew that the man sitting just beyond the curb had built his life around noticing details others missed. I remember turning slightly toward the window at one point, as if I felt something watching, but all I saw was the reflection of the evening sky against glass. My family continued speaking, unaware that every word was now sitting in a silence that didn't belong to them anymore. And Ethan Cole, for reasons I would not understand until much later, did not leave when he should have. He simply watched, and in that watching, something irreversible began to form. I did not realize at first that silence could have weight, but it did, the kind of weight that settles into a room after words have already done their damage. I was still standing in the same spot when my mother finally spoke again, her voice softer now, almost careful, as if she was trying to smooth over what had already been said without actually undoing it. "Emily, you know we just want what is best for you," she said, and I nodded automatically because that was what I always did when I did not want to become the problem in the room. Across from her, my uncle leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who believed time had already proven him right. He glanced at me once briefly, like I was a conclusion he had already reached, then returned his attention to his glass of iced tea as if I had already left the conversation. I remember thinking how strange it was that a person could be present in a room and still be treated like a memory. Outside, the evening light had started to fade, stretching long shadows across the hardwood floor, and I considered leaving early, pretending I had somewhere important to be, but I stayed because leaving would have felt like admitting something I was not ready to name. That was when I noticed, through the living room window, a black vehicle still parked across the street. It had been there longer than it should have been for a simple meeting, but I told myself not to think about it. Inside that vehicle, Ethan Cole had not moved. He had not spoken to anyone, had not made a single call, but his attention had shifted in a way that made the world outside the house feel suddenly smaller. He had heard enough to understand patterns, not just words but the structure behind them, the way certain sentences were not opinions but habits. When his assistant had asked if he was ready to leave earlier, he had not answered immediately. Instead, he had continued to look at the house as if waiting for something that had not yet revealed itself completely. Back inside, my family had moved on to other topics, as families do when they decide a subject is no longer worth holding, but I could not let go of the feeling that something had changed in a way I could not see yet. I excused myself eventually, the words automatic, my voice steady in a way that felt practiced rather than real, and I walked through the hallway toward the front door while carrying the same heaviness that had followed me all evening. As I reached for the handle, I glanced one more time toward the street. The black vehicle was still there. And for the first time that night, I wondered if being unseen was the same as being safe, or if it was simply the moment before someone finally decided to look too closely. I stepped out of the house feeling like I had left part of myself behind, the kind of feeling that does not announce itself loudly but instead follows you in quiet fragments, in the rhythm of your footsteps, in the way your breath feels slightly too controlled. The night air outside was cooler than I expected, around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the faint smell of damp pavement and cut grass from neighboring lawns, and I kept my arms close to my body as I walked down the front steps. I did not look back immediately, because looking back would have meant acknowledging something I was not ready to define. Across the street, the black vehicle was still there, and this time I noticed something different. The headlights were off, but the engine was running, a subtle vibration in the air that I could not explain why I noticed at first. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just another car in a quiet, suburban street at night, but my instincts did not fully agree. Inside that vehicle, Ethan Cole was no longer looking at documents or checking his phone. He was watching the house with a focus that did not shift, the kind of attention that does not feel like curiosity but like calculation. He had heard enough earlier to understand that what had been said inside was not just family disagreement, but something deeper, something repetitive, something that shaped a person over time without asking for permission. When I reached the sidewalk, I hesitated for a moment, keys in hand, pretending to search my purse just so I could delay walking past the street where the car was parked. I could feel my pulse steady but alert, the way it gets when your mind is trying to decide whether something is real or just imagined threat. That was when I finally heard the sound of a door opening behind me, not from my house, but from the vehicle across the street. I turned slightly, not fully, just enough to confirm what I already suspected, and I saw him for the first time clearly. Ethan Cole did not move quickly. He did not need to. He stepped out like someone who belonged to a different kind of silence, one that people instinctively made space for without understanding why. He was tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored coat that looked ordinary until you noticed how perfectly it fit his posture. There was nothing theatrical about him, nothing exaggerated, but there was a stillness that made the air feel measured. I remember my first instinct was not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that arrives before understanding. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he closed the car door behind him with a controlled motion and stood for a brief moment as if confirming a decision he had already made inside the house. Then he walked toward the sidewalk, not crossing into my space, but close enough that I could no longer pretend I had not seen him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost quiet, and that made it harder to dismiss. "You do not need to go back inside there tonight," he said, and I blinked because I had not told him I was planning to return anywhere. I tightened my grip on my keys, instinctively placing distance between us with the only thing I had available. "I do not know who you think you are," I said, trying to keep my tone steady, but it came out thinner than I intended. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the boundary without challenging it. "That is fair," he replied, "but I was there long enough to hear enough." My stomach tightened at the implication, not because of accusation, but because of recognition, because part of me already knew he was not guessing. I glanced back at the house once, and for the first time that evening it looked smaller than it had before, like something that had been reduced in scale by perspective rather than distance. When I looked back again, Ethan had not moved closer, but he had not moved away either. He simply stood there, as if waiting for the next decision to belong to me instead of them. I remember the exact moment I realized I was no longer fully in control of where the night was going, and it was not because anything dramatic had happened, but because for the first time in a long while, someone had spoken to me as if my situation was something worth interrupting. Ethan Cole remained on the edge of the sidewalk, not invading my space, not forcing proximity, but holding a kind of stillness that made it difficult to ignore him completely. The suburban street around us felt quieter than before, as if even the distant hum of passing cars on the main road half a mile away had softened. I shifted my weight slightly, unsure whether to continue walking or stay rooted in place, and that hesitation seemed to register with him without him needing to ask a single question. "You do not know anything about my family," I finally said, though my voice lacked the firmness I wanted it to carry. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. "That is true," he replied calmly. But I know what I heard, and I know how people sound when they believe someone in their own house does not matter. The words should have felt intrusive, but instead they landed with an uncomfortable accuracy I did not want to admit. I looked away toward the empty street, trying to find something neutral to anchor myself to, like the glow of a distant streetlight or the faint outline of mailboxes lined evenly along the curb. My life had always been defined by things that were stable but not supportive, structures that existed but did not hold me. Ethan took a small step closer, not enough to cross into my space, but enough that I could no longer pretend he was just a passerby. I am not asking you to trust me, he added, his tone steady. I am telling you that what I heard was not normal, and you do not need to return to it tonight. I exhaled slowly, frustration mixing with confusion, because the problem was not that he was wrong, but that he was too observant. People like him were not supposed to exist in my world, not in suburban streets with porch lights and quiet houses where everything was supposed to be safe enough to ignore. You do not understand what you are getting involved in, I said, more firmly this time, though it came out more like exhaustion than resistance. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted slightly, like a decision being held rather than made. I understand enough, he said, and then he paused for a brief moment before continuing. And I understand that staying silent about it is not the same as it being acceptable. The wind moved lightly through the trees along the street, carrying the faint rustle of leaves that sounded almost like distant conversation, and I became aware of how aware I was of everything around me. I noticed how my hand still held my keys tightly, how my breathing was slightly uneven, how the distance between us felt less like space and more like a choice waiting to be resolved. Ethan did not pressure me further. Instead, he simply looked toward the house once more, and I followed his gaze without meaning to. For a moment, the windows of my home reflected only darkness, no movement, no sound, no indication of what had just taken place inside, and that absence of clarity felt more unsettling than anything that had been said. When I looked back at him, Ethan was already watching me again, not with expectation, but with certainty that the night had already changed shape, even if I had not yet decided what that meant for me. I did not move right away, even though every instinct I had told me that staying in one place with a stranger at night was not something I should be doing. But the truth was that nothing about this situation felt simple enough to categorize as safe or unsafe anymore. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away from me, still on the edge of the sidewalk, his posture steady in a way that suggested patience rather than hesitation, as if he was used to waiting for people to catch up to conclusions he had already reached. The streetlight above us flickered slightly, casting a soft uneven glow across the pavement, and I became aware of how quiet the neighborhood had become, as if the world had stepped back to give space to something I did not fully understand yet. You keep looking back at that house, Ethan said after a moment, his voice calm but direct, and I realized he was right without meaning to admit it out loud. I was not just looking at the house, I was measuring distance, as if distance alone could decide what was acceptable. It is my home, I replied, though even as I said it, the word felt heavier than it should have. Ethan tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not sympathetic, just observant. A home does not sound like that, he said, and I did not respond immediately because I did not know how to. Behind me, the house remained still, its windows dark, its presence unchanged, yet it felt different now, as if something had been exposed without anything physically breaking. I took a small step forward, intending to walk away from both him and the situation entirely, but Ethan matched the movement only enough to stay within conversation distance, never blocking me, never forcing me to stop, just present in a way that made ignoring him feel less natural than acknowledging him. Why do you even care? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended, and the question hung between us for a moment longer than I expected. He did not answer immediately, which somehow made his eventual response feel more deliberate. Because I recognized something in what I heard, he said, and I know what it looks like when someone has been told their voice does not matter long enough to believe it. The words landed with a precision that made me uncomfortable, not because they were harsh, but because they were too accurate in a way I had not invited. I looked down at my hands, still holding my keys, realizing I had not loosened my grip since leaving the house. My fingers ached slightly, a small physical reminder that I was still grounded in something real, even if everything else felt uncertain. You are making assumptions about people you do not know, I said, though my tone lacked conviction. Ethan's expression did not change, but his voice softened just slightly. Then correct me, he said simply, and the invitation in those words felt more complicated than a demand. I did not answer right away. Instead, I turned my gaze back toward the street, noticing how empty it was, how even the distant sound of traffic felt detached, like it belonged to another world entirely. For a brief moment, I considered what it would mean to step forward, to leave without explanation, to return to the version of my night that existed before he spoke to me. But something about that thought no longer felt like safety, felt like repetition. When I looked back at Ethan, he was still there, still waiting, not for control, not for compliance, but for a decision I had not yet learned how to make. I stayed where I was, not because I felt safe, but because moving suddenly felt like making a decision I was not fully prepared to understand yet. The night air around us remained steady, around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, but I no longer noticed the temperature in the same way I had earlier, because my attention kept returning to the fact that Ethan Cole had not left. He was still there, standing a few feet away, not invading my space, not pushing me in any direction, but present in a way that made absence no longer feel like the default option. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my thoughts, and for the first time I realized how unfamiliar it was to have someone wait for my response instead of assuming it. "You keep talking like you understand everything," I said, though my voice came out softer than I intended, and I immediately regretted how uncertain it sounded. Ethan did not react with superiority or dismissal. Instead, he simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that I was still deciding how to interpret him. "I do not understand everything," he replied, "but I understand patterns, and what I heard inside that house is a pattern I recognize." I felt a small tightening in my chest at the word pattern, because it suggested repetition, something ongoing rather than isolated. I shifted my gaze toward the house again, and this time it looked even more distant, as if it belonged to a version of my life I was no longer fully inside. Ethan followed my glance but did not comment on it. Instead, he continued in the same calm tone. "You are not required to explain anything to me," he said, "but you also do not need to stay in a situation where you are being spoken about like that." The simplicity of the statement unsettled me more than anything else he had said, because it removed all complexity from something I had spent years rationalizing. I opened my mouth to respond, but no immediate words came, only a hesitation that revealed more than I wanted. A faint breeze moved through the trees lining the street, and I noticed for the first time how quiet the neighborhood truly was, the kind of quiet that feels artificial when your mind is still loud. Ethan glanced briefly toward the house again, then back at me, his expression unchanged but more focused now. "I am not asking you to decide anything right now," he added, "but I am telling you that you do not have to go back in there tonight." The phrase tonight landed differently than before, because it implied continuity, as if the moment had already extended beyond itself. I tightened my grip on my keys again without realizing it, and only then noticed how tense my hand had become. "And where exactly would I go?" I asked, more out of disbelief than acceptance, because the question had always felt rhetorical in my life. Ethan did not answer immediately, which again made his eventual response feel intentional rather than reactive. "Somewhere you can think without being interrupted," he said simply. I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh without humor, because the idea of uninterrupted thought felt foreign enough to sound unrealistic. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt different from the silence I had just left behind in the house. This silence did not feel like dismissal, felt like space. When I finally looked at him again, Ethan had not moved closer, but he also had not stepped away. He remained exactly where he had been, steady and deliberate, as if waiting for something that could not be forced, only chosen. And for the first time that night, I became aware that the most unfamiliar part of everything happening was not his presence, but the possibility that I might not have to walk back into the place I had always called home. I remember the exact moment the idea of leaving stopped feeling like something impossible and started feeling like something I might actually have to consider. And it frightened me more than I expected because uncertainty had always been easier than choice. Ethan Cole remained beside me on the sidewalk, still not crossing the invisible boundary between us, but close enough that his presence no longer felt like something I could simply ignore. The night had settled deeper now, the streetlights casting long pale circles on the pavement, and somewhere far away I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the highway, steady and indifferent. My phone vibrated in my hand suddenly, breaking the silence between us, and I looked down to see my mother's name on the screen. I hesitated before answering because something about the timing felt wrong in a way I could not explain. When I finally did, her voice came through quickly, too quickly, as if she had been waiting to speak before I even picked up. "Emily, where are you?" she asked, and I could hear something sharp underneath her tone. Something that felt less like concern and more like control returning after a brief absence. I glanced at Ethan instinctively, though he had not moved or reacted to the call. "I am outside," I said simply, not giving details, and there was a pause on the other end of the line that stretched longer than it should have. Then my mother spoke again, quieter this time but more deliberate. "You need to come back inside and stop making this complicated," she said, and I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly toward me. Not intrusive, just attentive, as if he was observing how language changed shape in real time. "I am not making anything complicated," I replied, though even as I said it, I realized how often I had been told the opposite until I stopped questioning it. There was a faint sound on the call, my uncle's voice in the background, saying something I could not fully hear, but the tone carried easily through the line, and something inside me tightened again. Ethan did not interrupt, did not signal anything, but I noticed the way his posture changed almost imperceptibly, as if he had registered enough context without needing full clarity. "We are trying to keep things stable for you," my mother continued, and I closed my eyes briefly because I had heard that sentence in different forms my entire life. Stability had always been the word used to describe everything that never changed, even when it should have. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the darkened screen in my hand, feeling the familiar weight of obligation trying to settle back into place. Ethan finally spoke after a pause, his voice even and calm. "That did not sound like a conversation that leaves room for you," he said, and I exhaled slowly, not because I agreed immediately, but because denying it required more effort than I had left at that moment. I looked toward the house again, and this time it felt farther away than before, not physically, but in a way that made it harder to imagine stepping back inside as if nothing had happened. "They are my family," I said, though it sounded more like a reminder than a justification. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. "And families can still be wrong about how they treat someone," he replied. The words should have felt simple, almost obvious, but instead they landed with a kind of weight that made my thoughts slow down. For the first time, I did not immediately respond, because part of me was beginning to understand that staying was not the same thing as belonging, and leaving was not the same thing as losing everything. When I finally looked at Ethan again, he was still waiting, not pushing, not pulling, just remaining exactly where he had been from the beginning, as if the only thing he was certain of was that I deserved the space to decide what came next. I do not remember making the decision to move, only the moment my body finally accepted what my mind had been circling around for hours, as if hesitation itself had reached a limit and simply stopped holding me in place. The phone was still warm in my hand after the call ended, my mother's voice lingering in a way that felt heavier than the silence that followed it, and I stood there on the sidewalk with the house behind me and the street stretching forward like a question that no one else was going to answer for me. Ethan Cole had not spoken since my last words, but he had not left either, and that absence of pressure somehow felt more intentional than any argument could have been. The air was still cool, around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and I remember noticing how even the smallest sounds seemed sharper now, like the distant rustle of leaves or the faint hum of a passing car 2 streets away. I looked once more toward the house, expecting something to change if I waited long enough, but nothing did. No movement in the windows, no shift in light, no sign that the words spoken inside earlier had ever carried weight beyond that moment. Ethan finally broke the silence, not with urgency, but with the same calm tone he had used all night. "You do not have to decide anything permanent right now," he said, and for the first time I realized he had never once tried to take the decision away from me, only to make space for it. I exhaled slowly, my fingers loosening slightly around the keys I had been holding so tightly that my palm ached. "If I leave tonight," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, "it does not fix anything." Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth rather than correcting it. "No," he replied, "but it gives you distance, and distance is sometimes The only place where clarity starts. The word clarity felt foreign in a way that made me almost want to reject it immediately, because clarity had never been part of how I made decisions before. I had always chosen endurance over understanding, staying over questioning, silence over confrontation. I glanced down the street, noticing for the first time how far it seemed to extend without interruption, as if the entire neighborhood had been designed for people who never questioned where they were going next. My phone buzzed again briefly in my hand, another message I did not open, and I realized I was no longer interested in what it might say. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it no longer felt like it had authority over me in that moment. Ethan took a small step toward the curb, not toward me, but toward a direction that suggested possibility rather than demand. "If you are going back inside," he said, "I will leave. If you are not, I will make sure you are not alone on this street tonight." There was no force in his words, no pressure hidden beneath them, only structure, as if he was offering presence as a fact rather than an argument. I looked at him then properly, not as someone interrupting my night, but as someone who had remained consistent through every shift in it. Behind me, the house still stood unchanged, but it no longer felt like it was holding me in place. For the first time, I understood that nothing physically prevented me from walking away except the belief that I should not. I took one step forward, then another, and as I moved past the line where the sidewalk met the street, I realized Ethan had matched my direction without closing the distance between us. We did not speak as we walked, and the silence this time did not feel like absence or tension, but like something unfolding slowly enough for me to recognize it. And as the house faded behind us, I felt something unfamiliar settle in its place, not certainty, not relief, but the beginning of space where neither of those things had ever been allowed to exist. I kept walking even after the house disappeared behind the curve of the street, and for the first time that night I noticed how different the world felt when I was no longer standing in front of something that expected me to return. The pavement beneath my steps was uneven in small ways I had never paid attention to before, faint cracks filled with thin lines of grass, the kind of detail you only notice when your mind is no longer occupied with surviving conversations you never agreed to have. Ethan Cole walked slightly behind and to the side, not leading me, not following me in a controlling way, but maintaining a distance that felt intentional, as if he understood that proximity could become pressure if handled incorrectly. The air was still cool, around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I could feel temperature again without it being overshadowed by tension. We reached the end of the street where the neighborhood began to open toward a wider road, and I finally slowed my steps, uncertain whether I had been walking toward something or simply away from everything I had known. Ethan stopped at the same moment I did, not mirroring me, but arriving at the same conclusion without needing explanation. For a while, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt fundamentally different from the silence I had grown up with, because this one did not feel like dismissal or absence, but like space that had been deliberately left unfilled. I looked down at my hands again, noticing that I had finally loosened my grip on my keys entirely, and the realization startled me more than I expected. "I do not know what I am supposed to do next," I said quietly, the words coming out without planning, without structure, as if they had been waiting beneath everything else I had said all night. Ethan did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady calm that had followed me from the beginning. "You are not supposed to know yet," he said. "You are only supposed to not go back to where you were treated like you did not matter." I exhaled slowly at that, because it was not advice and it was not instruction. It was simply a statement that refused to make my confusion a failure. In the distance I could see the faint outline of passing cars on the main road, their headlights moving like quiet signals of a world continuing regardless of what I decided. I realized then that nothing about my life was going to change in a single moment, but something had already shifted in how I understood choice itself. Ethan turned slightly, not toward me, but toward the direction I had come from, and I noticed for the first time that he was no longer watching the house, because it no longer required attention. "What happens now?" I asked. And I did not realize until after I said it that I was not asking him for permission or direction, but for confirmation that I was not alone in the uncertainty. He glanced at me then, not with control, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet certainty that did not demand agreement. "Now you continue forward," he said simply, "and you decide what parts of your life deserve to come with you." The words did not feel like a conclusion, but they did feel like an opening, something I had not been given before in any form that required nothing from me except movement. I looked once more in the direction of the house I had left behind, but it no longer felt like something pulling me backward. It felt like something that had finally stopped speaking for me. When I turned forward again, Ethan was already walking slowly ahead, not pulling me, not leading me, just giving me a direction that I could choose to follow or not. And as I took my first step to match his pace, I realized that the most important change of the night was not that I had left something behind, but that for the first time, I understood I was allowed to keep walking without asking for permission to do so.